The rain fell in sheets across the empty streets of Millfield, washing away the day's heat but doing nothing to cleanse the fear that had gripped the small town since yesterday's strange lights in the sky. Most residents had retreated inside their homes, curtains drawn tight against the unusual storm and whatever might be lurking in it. No one noticed the small figure darting between shadows, barely 3 feet tall with skin the color of pale moonstone that occasionally shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. Large, dark eyes blinked against the downpour as Alara sought any shelter from the relentless cold. Her thin body trembled, both from fear and the dropping temperature that her species was ill-equipped to handle. Just a little further, she whispered to herself in a language no human would understand, though she had already begun to absorb English from her brief encounters. Her ship's emergency translation program had activated during the crash, implanting linguistic patterns directly into her neural network. The technology was saving her life, even as the ship itself lay in smoking ruins in the forest beyond town. Earlier that day, she had approached a human female with young offspring, hoping their maternal instincts might extend to a child of any species. Instead, the woman had screamed, gathering her children and running while shouting about monsters and invasions. Similar rejections had followed throughout the day, rocks thrown by teenage boys, doors slammed in her face, and finally a mob forming with flashlights and improvised weapons. Alara had no way to tell them she was just a scientific apprentice, separated from her exploration team when their ship malfunctioned. She couldn't explain that her people were peaceful researchers, not invaders. The universal translator worked for comprehension, not communication. She understood their fear but couldn't dispel it. A particularly violent gust of wind drove needles of rain against her sensitive skin. Alara gasped and ducked under the awning of what humans called a hardware store, curling into the smallest ball possible in the doorway's shadow. Her body's natural glow dimmed to conserve energy, making her nearly invisible in the darkness. "Please find me," she whispered, thinking of her team, though she knew the chances were slim. The emergency beacon in her suit had been damaged in the crash. Unless she could repair it, she was stranded on this hostile world. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Alara flinched. On her homeworld, there were no electrical storms, the sound was alien and terrifying. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, she hadn't eaten since the crash nearly 30 hours ago. Without sustenance, her body would soon begin shutting down non-essential systems, including her translation ability. Then she would be truly lost. The splashing of approaching footsteps made her press deeper into the shadowed doorway. Heavy boots stopped directly in front of her hiding place, and a beam of light swept across the ground. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voice belonged to an elderly human male, his tone quavering but kind. "I thought I saw something glowing." Alara remained perfectly still, but a sudden shiver betrayed her presence as a faint blue illumination rippled involuntarily across her skin. The light lowered, revealing a weathered face beneath a rain-soaked hat. Deep wrinkles framed kind eyes that widened at the sight of her. "Well now," Thomas Mills whispered, lowering himself slowly to one knee despite the protest of his aging joints. "What have we here?" Unlike the others, he didn't scream or run. He simply tilted his head, studying her with curiosity rather than fear. "You must be freezing, little one," he said softly, extending his umbrella to shield her from the rain. "I don't know what you are or where you came from, but nobody deserves to be out in this storm." Thomas Mills had lived alone for the past 8 years, ever since his wife Eleanor had passed. Their modest 2-story home at the edge of town now felt cavernous and empty, filled with memories but little else. His daughter lived 3 states away with her own family, calling dutifully every Sunday but rarely visiting. At 72, he had settled into the quiet routine of retirement, morning coffee on the porch, afternoons tending his vegetable garden, evenings with books or old westerns on television. Tonight had broken that routine. Something had drawn him out into the storm, restlessness, perhaps, or the strange feeling that had nagged at him since the peculiar lights appeared in the sky. He hadn't planned to walk all the way to town, but his feet kept moving as if guided by something beyond himself. Now, looking at the trembling alien child huddled in the doorway, Thomas understood why. "Can you understand me?" he asked gently, keeping the umbrella extended between them like a peace offering. "I'm Thomas. I won't hurt you." The small creature's eyes, deep indigo with no visible pupils, studied him warily. She nodded once, a remarkably human gesture that made Thomas's heart clench. "Would you like to come somewhere dry? Get something to eat?" He gestured vaguely in the direction of his home. "No strings attached. You can leave any time you want." Elara understood his words, but trust was harder to translate. On her world, strangers didn't offer help without expectation. Yet this human's energy signature radiated something unfamiliar, a gentle concern without underlying deception. Or perhaps she was simply too exhausted to read him properly. Hunger made the decision for her. With another small nod, she slowly uncurled from her hiding place. Thomas suppressed a gasp as she stood. Despite her alien features, the luminescent skin, the lack of visible ears, the small ridges along her forehead, there was something undeniably childlike in her proportions and movements. She couldn't be more than the equivalent of 8 or 9 Earth years. "That's it," he encouraged, keeping his voice soft. "My truck's just down the block. Can you walk?" Elara took a tentative step, then another. Without warning, her knees buckled. Thomas reacted instinctively, catching her small form before she hit the ground. The contact sent a mild electric tingle through his hands, not unpleasant, but certainly not human. "I've got you," he murmured, gathering her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as a bundle of sticks. "Let's get you home." 20 minutes later, Thomas carried the alien child through his front door, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure how to ask. He settled her on the living room sofa, wrapping her in Eleanor's old quilt while he bustled about making hot chocolate and warming soup. "I don't know what you eat," he called from the kitchen, "but soup is usually a safe bet for anyone under the weather." Elara watched him move between rooms, her translator working overtime to process his constant gentle chatter. The human dwelling fascinated her, full of objects whose purpose she couldn't determine and images of other humans preserved in frames. Most intriguing was the absence of technology she recognized. No atmospheric regulators, no matter synthesizers, no communication arrays. When Thomas returned with a tray, she sat up straighter, her natural glow brightening slightly with curiosity. "Easy now," Thomas said, setting a steaming mug and bowl before her. "It's hot. Small sips." He demonstrated, blowing on the soup before taking a spoonful. Elara mimicked his actions precisely, her eyes widening as the flavors hit her tongue. A soft chirping sound escaped her, the first noise Thomas had heard her make. "Good?" he asked with a small smile. Elara nodded enthusiastically, taking another careful spoonful. Thomas settled into his armchair, watching her eat with an odd sense of peace. Just hours ago, he had been alone, another quiet evening stretching before him. Now he was sharing his home with a being from another world. "You're safe here," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Whatever happens next, tonight you're safe." 3 days passed with Elara hidden away in Thomas's spare bedroom. The initial wariness between them gradually softened as they established a tentative routine. Thomas discovered that while Elara couldn't, or wouldn't, speak English aloud, she understood everything perfectly. More surprisingly, on the second morning, he found a note written in careful, childish letters: "Thank you for food. Need metal parts to fix communicator." "So you can write our language," Thomas had said, impressed. "That's handy." Another note appeared beside his coffee cup: "Translation device helps. I learn quickly." Thomas began bringing home various small electronics from his workshop in the garage: old radios, a broken tablet, spare wiring. Elara's eyes would light up, sometimes literally, as she meticulously disassembled them, working on some device she kept mostly hidden beneath her bed covers. By the fourth day, Thomas noticed Elara's skin had taken on a healthier glow, the bioluminescent patterns pulsing in what he came to recognize as contentment. She ate ravenously, preferring sweet fruits, nuts, and oddly enough, raw carrots from his garden. She avoided meat entirely, recoiling at the scent of bacon one morning. "Different digestion, I guess," Thomas murmured, making a mental note to prepare more vegetable dishes. Their breakthrough came on the fifth evening when Thomas was showing Elara how to play checkers on the coffee table. The local news played quietly on the television, background noise until a familiar phrase caught his attention. "The search continues for what witnesses describe as a small alien creature spotted in Millfield earlier this week," the reporter announced. "Local authorities urge residents to report any unusual sightings but warn against approaching what could be a dangerous entity." The screen showed grainy footage from someone's phone, a small glowing figure darting between buildings. Thomas felt Elara grow tense beside him, her luminescence dimming to nearly black. "Hey now," he said gently, switching off the TV. "You're safe here, remember?" Elara's hand trembled as she placed a checker piece. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, she spoke aloud for the first time, her voice high and musical with an odd reverberating quality. "Not dangerous," she said, the words carefully formed. "Just lost." Thomas blinked back sudden tears. "I know that, little one. My name." "Elara," she continued haltingly. "Junior Science Observer. 5th rank." Thomas smiled. "That's quite a title for someone so young." 14 cycles, she replied, then frowned in concentration. "Maybe 9 Earth years?" "Well, Elara, Junior Science Observer 5th rank," Thomas said, extending his hand formally across the checkerboard, "I'm very pleased to officially meet you." After a moment's hesitation, Elara placed her small hand in his, her skin emitting a soft blue glow where they touched. "Your government will take me," she said quietly. "For studying." Cut open. The blunt assessment chilled Thomas to the bone, particularly because he couldn't deny its probability. He'd lived long enough to know how humans treated things they feared or didn't understand. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he replied firmly. "You're not a thing to be studied. You're a child." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in his rocking chair by the window, watching for unfamiliar cars or suspicious movement in the darkness. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in years, someone needed him, truly needed him. In the spare room across the hall, Elara worked by the light of her own skin, connecting delicate wires inside her partially repaired emergency beacon. The device was meant to signal her research vessel, but the crash had damaged critical components. Without proper materials, she could only modify it to broadcast on Earth frequencies, a risky proposition given the hostility she'd encountered. She paused, fingers hovering over the activation switch. Through the open door, she could see Thomas's silhouette, his vigilant presence a testament to something she had never experienced from humans before: protection. Care. Perhaps even affection. Quietly, she set the device aside. Tomorrow would be soon enough to decide whether to signal for help or remain in this unlikely sanctuary a little longer. The inevitable discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon when Thomas's neighbor, Mrs. Patel, brought over a casserole unannounced. The retired schoolteacher had been checking in on Thomas regularly since Eleanor passed, convinced that a man living alone would starve without intervention. "Thomas, your garden is looking lovely, but you're letting the mail pile up again," she called, using her spare key to let herself in as she often did. "I brought you my vegetable biryani that you, oh." She froze in the doorway to the kitchen where Thomas and Elara sat at the table, drawing pictures together with colored pencils. Elara's skin flared bright yellow in alarm, and she darted behind Thomas's chair. Jasmine, Thomas said evenly, though his heart hammered in his chest. I can explain. Mrs. Patel carefully set down her casserole dish, removed her glasses, cleaned them methodically, and put them back on. Thomas Mills, she said finally. Is that what I think it is? Thomas corrected firmly. Her name is Elara. She's a child, Jasmine. A lost child. Mrs. Patel took a deep breath, then to Thomas's surprise, knelt down to peer behind his chair. Hello, Elara, she said softly, the same tone she'd used with nervous kindergartners for 30 years. I'm sorry I startled you. Slowly, Elara emerged, her glow returning to a cautious blue. She studied the older woman carefully before offering a small wave. Well, Mrs. Patel said, straightening up with only a slight grimace at her arthritic knees. This certainly explains why you've been turning down my dinner invitations lately. By evening, their secret had expanded to include 5 people, Mrs. Patel, her son Dr. Rohan Patel, the town's only pediatrician, Reverend Jackson from Thomas's church, Officer Miguel Ortiz, who had been a student of Mrs. Patel's and now served as a junior deputy, and Louise Winters, who ran the hardware store where Thomas had found Elara. They gathered in Thomas's living room, speaking in hushed tones while Elara sat cross-legged on the couch, alternatively fascinated and terrified by this sudden expansion of her human contact. The state police have been asking questions around town, Officer Ortiz explained. There's also a group of men in suits, they say they're from the CDC, but Miguel doesn't believe them. Government agents, most likely, Louise added. They were in my store yesterday, asking if I'd seen anything unusual the night of the storm. We need to get her out of town, Reverend Jackson suggested. My sister has a cabin in the mountains. No, Thomas interrupted firmly. Running would only confirm their suspicions. Besides, Elara is trying to contact her people. She needs to stay near where they might look for her. Elara nodded, writing quickly on her notepad, signal needs height. Working on amplifier. Dr. Patel, who had been quietly observing Elara with professional interest, spoke up. What if we don't hide her at all? What if we introduce her to the town on our terms, before the government can take control of the narrative? That's madness, Louise objected. Have you seen how people are talking? Half the town thinks we're being invaded. Which is precisely why hiding won't work long-term, the doctor countered. Fear thrives in ignorance. If people meet her, see she's just a child. She's not just anything, Thomas interrupted protectively. Elara tugged at his sleeve, then wrote, Dr. Wright. Hiding equals fear. My people value knowledge sharing. As they debated long into the night, none of them noticed the unmarked black SUVs turning onto Thomas's street, or the men in tactical gear deploying into positions around the house. The pounding on the door came at dawn. Federal agents. Open up. Thomas, who had fallen asleep in his armchair, jerked awake. The others had gone home hours ago, leaving him and Elara alone. He rushed to the spare bedroom, finding Elara already awake, her eyes wide with terror. The back door, he whispered urgently. Mrs. Patel's house. Go. But as they reached the kitchen, floodlights illuminated the yard. Figures with weapons moved behind the windows. Thomas Mills, a voice boomed through a megaphone. We know about the alien entity. Surrender it immediately. You have 30 seconds to comply. Thomas looked down at Elara, who clung to his hand, her skin pulsing with frightened crimson flashes. In that moment, all his doubt vanished. Whatever happened next, he would not let them take her. Stay behind me, he said, squeezing her small hand. I'm not letting you face this alone. Thomas opened his front door to face a dozen agents in tactical gear, their weapons raised. Behind them, neighbors emerged from their homes in bathrobes and pajamas, drawn by the commotion. Step aside, Mr. Mills, ordered a stern-faced woman in a dark suit. "We're here for the extraterrestrial." Thomas stood firmly in the doorway. At 72, he cut an unimposing figure in his faded flannel robe, but his voice never wavered. "Her name is Elara," he replied loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "She's a child, marooned on our planet after an accident. She's harmed no one." The agent's expression hardened. "That's not your determination to make. This is a matter of national security." "It's a matter of basic decency," came another voice. Mrs. Patel pushed through the crowd, still wearing her nightgown under a hastily donned coat. "Thomas, we called everyone." As if on cue, more townspeople arrived, Officer Ortiz in uniform, Dr. Patel with his medical bag, Reverend Jackson, Louise, and dozens more Thomas recognized from town. They formed a loose semicircle behind the agents, watching intently. "This is an official government operation," the lead agent announced. "Civilians need to clear the area immediately." "On whose authority?" Dr. Patel stepped forward. "I've examined the child. She poses no biological threat. And I've spent a week with her in my home," Thomas added. "If she meant harm, I'd have seen it by now." A murmur spread through the crowd. The agent conferred briefly with her colleagues, clearly unprepared for organized resistance. Behind Thomas, Elara trembled but remained standing. Slowly, she moved to his side, blinking in the harsh floodlights. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers as many saw her for the first time. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but clear in the morning stillness. "I am Elara. Junior Science Observer. I am sorry for frightening you." The simple introduction, delivered with such obvious nervousness, transformed the atmosphere instantaneously. Where there had been an alien threat, now stood a child, strange, certainly, but unmistakably a child. From the back of the crowd, someone called out, "Let the girl speak." The lead agent hesitated, then lowered her hand, signaling her team to stand down temporarily. 2 minutes. Elara looked up at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "My people are explorers and scientists," she explained, gaining confidence. "We study worlds peacefully. My team will come for me when they receive my signal." She gestured to the small device clutched in her hand. "I need only to activate it from somewhere high." "The water tower," Louise suggested immediately. "Highest point in town." The crowd began to voice support, but the agent cut them off. "That's enough. This creature is coming with us for proper evaluation. Stand aside." "No," Thomas said simply, placing his hand protectively on Elara's shoulder. "She stays with me." What happened next would later be described as the Millfield Stand, a moment when an entire town chose compassion over fear. One by one, residents moved to stand beside Thomas and Elara on the porch and front yard. Mrs. Patel, the Reverend Dr. Patel, Officer Ortiz, Louise, and then others, shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, mechanics, until nearly 100 people formed a human barrier between the agents and the alien child. The lead agent's radio crackled. After a tense conversation, she lowered it with a sigh. "Washington says to stand down," she announced reluctantly. "Apparently, this situation has attracted too much attention. Higher-ups want to negotiate." By sunset, an extraordinary agreement had been reached. Elara would remain in Thomas's custody, with regular check-ins from a scientific liaison. In exchange, she would share appropriate cultural and scientific knowledge. Most importantly, she would be allowed to send her signal from the water tower. As the summer sky darkened to purple, Thomas stood with Elara at the top of the tower, surrounded by their unlikely circle of protectors. The small device in her hands hummed to life, projecting a beam of light straight up into the stars. "How long will it take?" Thomas asked quietly, already dreading the answer. "Perhaps 1 Earth month," she replied. Perhaps longer. He nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. You'll be missed, you know. When you go. Ilara looked up at him, her indigo eyes reflecting the starlight. In my language, there is a word, Zivaril. It means, the family you choose. My people believe such bonds transcend distance. Thomas smiled through sudden tears. We have something similar here. We call it love. The device pulsed 3 times, then settled into a steady rhythm. Ilara slipped her small hand into Thomas's larger one. Then perhaps our worlds are not so different after all. 3 months later, when the research vessel finally appeared in the night sky above Millfield, it was greeted not by fear or weapons, but by a community gathered in welcome. Thomas stood at the center, Ilara beside him in a hand-sewn dress Mrs. Patel had made, her skin glowing joyful gold. The ship's arrival wasn't an ending but a beginning, the first official contact between humanity and Ilara's people. As diplomats and scientists from both worlds would later agree, it was not political strategy or military might that made peaceful relations possible, but the simple, powerful choice of an old man who saw a child in need and opened his door. In time, Ilara would travel between the stars as an ambassador, but she always returned to the small house at the edge of town, to the place and the people who had taught her that family could be found in the most unexpected places, even across the vast distances between worlds.